The following horror stories are all narrated with the permissions of the original authors. Links to the original stories will be located in the description, so if you enjoy them, be sure to go give them some love. I'm from a small town in Pennsylvania. Creepy stuff goes on here. By Reddit user, insert propaganda here. Part 1. So, I live in a small southern Pennsylvania town. For obvious reasons, I won't disclose its name, but we're located fairly close to the site of a major Civil War battle. It's a quiet little town, for the most part. Though lately we've seen a lot more folks moving in from nearby cities, looking for more affordable rent. So we're growing, I guess. Which I don't mind. The influx of people has inspired a downtown revitalization of sorts. We also have a lot of weird shit that goes on around here. Like the abandoned barn on the north side of town that screams intermittently throughout the night. Don't get any ideas though. The people dumb enough to go poking around in there come back either certifiably insane or not at all. Then there's the colony of feral dogs that live in the boonies. I call them dogs only for expediency's sake. They bear a striking resemblance to emaciated Dobermans, but make no mistake, these fuckers are easily the size of horses, and meaner than a nest of methed out hornets. Do not go near them or their territory. A buddy and I had a run-in with a pack of them some time back, and let me tell you, it was one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had. And then of course there's the entity known affectionately as Lanthorne Bryce, a 7-foot-tall, shadowy, scarecrow-looking thing who roams the grounds of the old McDougal Manor, carrying a kerosene lamp, hence the name. And from my own experience, he's harmless, benign even, just a tad unsettling to behold. Anyway, I have a story from when I was still in college, roughly 10 years ago, give or take. There's a state park on the outskirts, hundreds and hundreds of acres of beautiful woodland, cradling a sizable man-made lake. Some friends and I decided to camp out there one cool October night. Mainly, we needed a place to drink. All but one of us was underage, as well as do a little bit of smoking. So we rolled up to the campground and get a nice secluded site towards the rear, away from the main loop and all the squares who would decide to bring their families out for the weekend. Now, within the park is an old one-room church that was built around the time the town was founded, in the late 1700s or so. Officially, it was a normal Anabaptist church, but legend has it that after the congregation disbanded for mysterious reasons in about 1843, a certain cult moved in and used the church for their strange rituals. Rumor quickly spread that this cult worshipped an obscure deity and practiced human sacrifice, a rumor which was more or less confirmed when teenage girls began disappearing from the community. Naturally, the townsfolk didn't take too kindly to their daughters going missing, and one night, a small group of men from the neighboring farms got together, armed with rifles, pitchforks, and torches, and descended upon the old church. The men never returned, that is until one of them turned up 3.5 weeks later at a neighbor's homestead. He was half naked and delirious, muttering incessantly about the locust man who lives in the old church. Poor fellow died a few days later from unknown causes, and not a single trace of his comrades or the strange cult was ever found. By the time the state brought up the land for use as a park in the 1970s, the story had come to be regarded as nothing more than a campfire story, intended to gnaw away at the imaginations of young children. Though, a member of the park staff that I'm acquainted with has told me that despite the fact that the church had at that point been abandoned for over a century, the building was found to be in disarmingly good condition, as if it hadn't even aged with the world around it. So, my friends and I are sitting around a slowly dying fire, passing around a joint and a bottle of cheap gin, when Brett, the oldest, suggested that we take a midnight hike up to the old church. "Sounds spooky, right?" he said coyly. I was just intoxicated enough to think it was a great idea, as was Marcy, but Quinn and Greg were feeling apprehensive. Or frisky. They had a no-strings-attached arrangement, and I'm pretty sure they were going to take advantage of the opportunity for some alone time, if you know what I mean. Brett, Marcy, and I did our damnedest to plead our case, but after 10 minutes without success, we dropped the issue, grabbed a couple of flashlights, and set off down the trail. The first leg of the hike was uneventful. Still, the woods were just generally eerie after dark, so we were telling stories and joking around in an effort to compensate for just how creeped out we were. As we got closer to our destination, I caught the buzz of cicadas sounding faintly throughout the trees. I recall finding this odd because it was in the middle of autumn, and I'd never heard cicadas once summer had passed. Nevertheless, I shrugged it off. I'm no entomologist, so what do I know? I wasn't even sure if my two companions had thought anything of it. I could barely make out the break in the trees where the church lay just beyond. Brett shined his flashlight at the structure. As I mentioned before, it's a one-room church. Wooden walls painted yellowish white, and a shingled roof the color of burnt umber. Above the entrance is a modest steeple, with a single window perched just below the spire. Marcy began rolling up another joint, while Brett and I each lit up a cigarette. I was beginning to feel genuinely on edge. Of course, I simply chalked it up to the weed, so when Marcy offered me the burning fruit of her labor, I declined. It was then that I realized the cicadas had grown louder. Do you guys not hear that? I asked. What, you mean the cicadas? Brett eyed me quizzically. Yeah, dude, they're fucking loud. It's October. I feel like cicadas shouldn't even be out right now, Marcy chimed in. She passed the joint over to Brett, who half-heartedly accepted. He was nervous too, I could tell. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps erupted from within the church. At once, all three of us snapped our heads in this direction. More movement. It sounded as if something was lumbering up the stairs to get to the apex of the steeple. My gaze was inexplicably drawn to the window. Something was watching us. The dull night of the moon afforded me a glimpse of what I took to be two bulging scarlet orbs peering out from the darkened church. No sooner had I reciprocated their attention, they just vanished. I was left staring at an empty window. The drone of cicadas steadily grew around us, and within minutes, we were forced to cover our ears to muffle its cacophonous assault. It felt like the noise itself was trying to burrow its way into my fucking skull. And then it just stopped. Cautiously, we lowered our hands. The forest was utterly silent. What the hell was that about? Brett's words came in a hushed, frantic gasp. We really shouldn't stick around to find out, I implored. I don't think either of them disagreed either. Hey, guys? Marcy's voice was low and quivering. The apprehension in her tone was more than palpable. She motioned us toward the church. Every single inch of the structure was covered in a hideous, dark mass of cicadas. Hundreds of burning red eyes shone through the darkness, and all of them seemed to be fixed squarely upon us. That was enough. Without hesitating, we started booking it down the trail, not once looking back. The only sounds now were the dry leaves crunching beneath our feet and our panicked breathing. I remember distinctly, however, the feeling of being followed, as if whatever it was I saw in the church was watching our movements from a distance. When we made it back to camp, we found Quinn and Greg passed out in the tent, semi-clothed thankfully. We woke them up and explained what we had seen. They just brushed it off at first as a prank, but we pressed the issue until we'd convinced them otherwise. We all agreed that it'd be best to leave and come back for our gear in the morning. The event had definitely sobered me up, so we gathered up a few personal items, cigarettes, drugs, and booze, and I drove us back to Brett's apartment. That's where we stayed until sunrise, chain smoking, trying to process what the fuck had just happened. Had we just encountered the Locust Man of local lore? Given this town's propensity for weirdness, I wouldn't doubt it. I sometimes wonder why he didn't pursue us. Why we didn't meet the same fate as the angry townspeople did in the story. I really should just count my lucky goddamn stars, and be grateful to even be here typing this. But the question occasionally surfaces in my mind, and I don't really have an answer. Perhaps it was a warning of some kind. I'll never know. That's the only time I've ever run into the Locust Man. Brett and I went back in the morning to retrieve the rest of our camping gear, and when we arrived, we found the site relatively undisturbed, save for this: 5 small piles of cicada husks, placed deliberately inside the tent. I'll stop here for now. I'll definitely post more stories as I think of them. Believe me, I have no shortage of stories. Part 2. Hey guys, I was pleasantly surprised by the response to my first post. Thanks so much. Anyway, I've got some more stories. Hopefully they won't disappoint. So, someone commented about Lanthorne Bryce. As I mentioned in my first post, Lanthorne Bryce is an entity who roams the grounds of the old MacDougall Manor near the downtown area. He's a tall, gangly motherfucker. Reminds me of a scarecrow. He appears to be wearing a very broad-brimmed hat and tattered clothing. He has aberrantly long limbs, his arms fall below his knees, and he's never seen without his trusty kerosene lamp. Now, I've never had any direct encounters with him. I mean, I'll see him occasionally if I'm stumbling home from the bars in the early morning hours, and when I do, we always give one another a respectful nod of acknowledgement. But some folks around here only speak his name in apprehensive whispers. Nobody knows precisely where he came from. The story goes that the patriarch of the MacDougall family dabbled in the occult, and summoned Bryce to keep watch over his family and property. Well, after he and his wife died, and the children left town to put down roots in more enticing pastures, Bryce stuck around. The manor is now open to the public for tours and such. It's a piece of local history after all. But Bryce never shows himself during the daylight hours. He makes his rounds between midnight and just shortly before dawn. Not the most exciting tale, but it suffices, I guess. So, as I've said, I don't see him as malevolent. In fact, I've always asserted the contrary. He's a benign entity. After doing some digging, I managed to find someone who has had a face-to-face encounter with Bryce that confirms this. It happened to a friend of Marcy's. Let's call her Rebecca. Rebecca is a bartender at one of the local dives in town. She has a good head on her shoulders, so I don't see any reason not to believe her. This encounter took place after she had finished work one night. I'm going to copy and paste the body of the email she sent me about her experience. And here it is. First of all, I'm very glad you're doing this. I'm a huge fan of No Sleep myself, and I've always wondered why nobody has thought of to do this already. I'm also happy to finally be able to set the record straight about Bryce, because you know how the folks are here about him. So, it was a Tuesday night, and as you can imagine, the bar was fairly dead. We had a few of the regulars in, of course, but overall it was a pretty lousy night as far as my tips go. There was this one guy in there, whom I've never seen before, and he was throwing up some major creeper vibes my way. He sat at the far end of the bar, and whenever I'd bring him his drinks, he'd just give me the most menacing fucking grin. I'd catch him leering at me constantly when I was trying to serve other customers or restocking the bar or whatever. And he was making me super uncomfortable. Unfortunately, he wasn't doing anything overtly disruptive, so I couldn't just throw him out. Well, last call rolls around, and this creepy dude is still there. He orders one more drink and just sits there, staring at me with his eyes full of bad intentions. Finally, it's 2 a.m., and I tell him that he needs to leave so I can close up. He says not a word, just gets up and walks out the door. I was honestly fearing for my life at this point, thinking this asshole was going to be waiting outside for me. I thought about calling someone to come give me a lift home, but my phone was dead. I'd forgotten my charger, and the only number I knew off the top of my head was my roommate's, and she was on vacation with some old college friends. Just my frickin' luck, right? I almost spent the night at the bar, but I doubt the owners would have been too cool with that. So I finish up my work and leave the bar, anxious as fuck. Fortunately, when I get outside, I don't see any sign of the creeper guy, and I breathe a sigh of relief and start walking back to my apartment. Well, that relief quickly faded when I got halfway up the block and heard the footsteps. I glanced behind me and guess who I see? Yep, creeper guy, standing about 20 paces back, still leering, still grinning. He didn't even try to play it off like he wasn't following me. Thinking quickly, I pull out my dead phone and start having a pretend conversation. I hoped that if he thought I was talking to someone else, he'd think twice before trying anything funny. But no, this fucker was undeterred. Well, obviously I don't want this guy seeing where I live, so I quicken my pace slightly, which of course he then matches, and start heading in the direction of the police station. I think this guy realized what I was doing, because he starts off at a light jog and then starts picking up speed. Now my fight or flight instincts are kicking in, and seeing as how this was before I got my concealed weapon permit, which I applied for immediately the following day, mind you, I chose flight. I feel really stupid about the next part, but I honestly didn't know what else to do. I turned down the old alley that went behind the old McDougal place, in an attempt to lose him. As soon as I came upon it, I make a beeline around the corner, full-on sprint down the alley, and dive behind one of the bushes towards the edge of the property. Trust me, I'm not normally this dumb and panicky. Now, at the time I was very much regretting that decision, because I didn't even consider Lanthorne Bryce until after I had gone into hiding. I regretted it then, but after what happened, I no longer do. So I peek around the side and see the creeper walking up toward me. He didn't see me where I was hiding, but he had to have known I was somewhere around there, because he pauses and begins scanning the darkened yard. I'm guessing he either hadn't heard the story of Bryce or at least didn't believe in it, because he came right onto the fucking property, as determined as ever. I was shitting my pants now, since I was alone in the yard of a haunted house with a potentially murderous stalker after me. Thankfully, he started looking for me in a different part of the yard. Still a bit too close for comfort, but he was distracted at least. I was ready to take the opportunity to bolt to the police station, but then I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and who did I see looming over me? Lanthorne. Fucking Bryce Lanthorne. I don't know if you ever seen him up close, but it's a sight, man. His face kinda has the same color and texture as burnt wood, and he has no neck. It's all just head, from his shoulders up. His features look like they were basically carved into his visage. I could faintly make them out in the moonlight, just empty sockets for eyes in the mouth. And he was wearing what I can only assume were like black burlap rags, as well as that distinctive hat. Now, I'm about to let out the most blood-curdling scream I can muster, but before I could, he raised a gnarled finger to my lips, and in a hushed, gravely tone, he says, "Trust me." His mouth didn't move, but god damn it, he spoke nonetheless, and I don't know what it was about him, but I was suddenly overcome with a warm feeling of security. Like I instinctively knew that I could trust him, despite only ever having heard the stories and shit. So Creeper Guy is still scouring the property, looking for me. He was goddamn persistent, I'll give him that. He had to have been crazy, because I feel like your average creeper would have given up and gone home by now. But I'm a bartender, not a psychologist, so what the hell do I know? Well, I see Bryce slowly and quietly marching over to the creeper. I could tell he was doing it with purpose too, and maybe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but he seemed much taller than before. He got up directly behind the creeper and looked like he had easily about 6 feet on the guy. I see Bryce tap him on the shoulder. Guy hadn't heard him or seen him, I guess, so I'm assuming Bryce is able to make his presence known at will to whomever he chooses. Makes sense, wasn't he supposed to be like McDougal's guardian or whatever? That's a handy skill to have, I would think. So Bryce taps the guy on the shoulder. Guy whips around and looks up at the 12-foot-tall monstrosity staring down at him. He freaks and starts booking it, but Bryce extends his arm, and I mean that literally. His arm extended like he was goddamn Inspector Gadget or some shit, and grabs the guy by the scalp. Creeper is still screaming and begging for his life. Not gonna lie, it was pretty satisfying to hear that. Don't care if that makes me a terrible human. So, yeah, Bryce lifts him by the crown of his head and starts folding the guy up. Like, he folds the guy in half at the waist, then folds him in half again and again until the creeper is nothing but a minuscule block of meat. The sounds of his flesh tearing and his bones crunching made me gag. Once he was finished making the dude into a human napkin square, Bryce simply opens up his kerosene lamp and throws what used to be my stalker right into the flame. Bryce then looked over at me, tipped his hat, and disappeared back into the shadows. I ran the rest of the way home and bawled my eyes out until I finally fell asleep. That's the end of that email. But another user brought up an ice cream truck that runs all night and never has any ice cream. Coincidentally enough, I have heard an ice cream truck running sometimes as late as 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe 2 or 3 times in a month. You'll hear it coming from one end of the street one moment, and the next you'll hear it from the exact opposite end. Then it's 2 streets over, then it's 1 street behind, then 4 blocks away. Once I even heard it coming from 5 different places simultaneously. This was easily the most annoying experience of my life. Just imagine playing The Entertainer by Scott Joplin on 5 sets of speakers, and not synced up at all. Needless to say, I cut my cigarette break short that time. I haven't actually seen the thing, but it's still kind of weird. One last encounter before I go. This happened in 2013 when I first started my current job of working the night shift at a group home. On my first night there, the staff who was in charge of training me warned me about Annie Lacyface, who occasionally makes rounds in the neighborhood around 4:15 in the morning. She told me, if she comes, just answer the door. It seems counterintuitive given that she's creepy and kind of aggressive, but trust me, things will go much worse for you if you don't answer. Now, she's going to ask for someone named Casey, whoever that is. Politely tell her that Casey doesn't live here and send her on her way. Usually she accepts this answer and moves on to the next house, but she can be persistent at times, and if she does, tell her that Cassie doesn't live here until she leaves. Do not shut the door on her before she has moved off the property. I cannot stress this enough. Just trust me. I asked her what Annie's story was, and my coworker just kind of shrugged and said, nobody really knows. She could be part of some sort of summoning ritual gone wrong. Others say she's just a ghost of a young woman who used to live on the street. Point is, she's just been showing up and pestering everyone for the last 40 years. I asked my coworker what happens if I don't answer the door, and she just responded with, I don't know for sure, but nobody who hasn't opened the door for Annie is around to tell you about it. Needless to say, I didn't inquire any further. Fast forward a few nights later, my first night working alone, and as if on cue, at 4:15, I hear someone rapping at the front door. 3 knocks, exactly 1 second apart. I got up from the sofa and answered it. Standing before me was a small, gaunt woman wearing a lace veil which covered the top portion of her face. On the exposed lower half, her thin black lips curled in a maniacal sneer, revealing a single row of jagged teeth the color of ochre. Some kind of watery green ooze was dripping down the corners of her mouth. Her skin was a ghastly shade of white, and she wore what seemed to be the tattered remains of a once extravagant evening dress, now grown dingy and frayed. On top of that, she smelled like cooked onions left to fester in a heap of shit in the middle of a sticky Florida summer.
Can Cassie come out to play?
She hissed, her voice like 2 pieces of sandpaper scraping against one another. She phrased it like a statement rather than a question. Remembering my training, I replied, Cassie doesn't live here. Annie's smile faded and she hissed again.
Can Cassie come out and play?
Angrier this time. Cassie doesn't live here, I stated, firmly, trying to convey as much authority as I could, which was not at all easy given the circumstances. I couldn't see her eyes beneath that veil of hers, but I had the feeling that if she willed it, she could literally kill me with a look, as cliché as that sounds. She lingers for a minute or two, staring me down from behind her shroud. That malignant smile reappears so gradually it was unnerving. And she simply says, thank you. Her voice was nauseating. Well, she then proceeded to back away from the door, still looking right at me, mind you, and I noticed that she was gliding. Not walking, gliding. She glided all the way back onto the sidewalk, still staring at me. She moved down the sidewalk and headed off to the next house. I still deal with Anne on a regular basis, and it's always the same story. And that's all I'm going to post for now. I don't want to make this too long. I'll have some more soon. I intend to do a little research on Annie Lacyface, so hopefully next time I'll have some kind of history for her. Part 3. Hey everyone. Sorry it's been so long since my last update. Work has been really hectic. I'm pretty sure Annie Lacyface got the other night shift person we hired, so I have been picking up a lot of extra hours. But you didn't come to hear about my personal life. Now, someone had asked me about the feral dogs I mentioned in the first part. As I said, I have had an encounter with them. It happened about a year or so before the Locust Man incident. Allow me to set the scene. Just north of town is an industrial park, which has largely fallen into disuse since many of the businesses closed up their operations. It's an urbexer's wet dream, basically. There are plenty of abandoned factories and warehouses, and police presence in the area is all but non-existent. Now, just beyond this virtually abandoned industrial park, among the surrounding hills, is a place which has come to be known among the locals as the Barrens. A lush strip of woodland, about 3/4 of a mile deep, partitions it off from the factories and warehouses in the industrial park. Growing up, we were always discouraged from messing around in the old industrial park, and especially the Barrens. People went missing in the Barrens. Why they went missing, we were never told. So it was a muggy evening in July of 2006, and I had accompanied Brett to the industrial park so he could take some pictures for a school project. He wanted to do a photo shoot depicting the decline of industry in small town USA, or something pretentious like that. To make things interesting, we each consumed a chocolate weed chip cookie that Brett's stoner cousin had made. Boy, I wish we hadn't. We'd been there for roughly 2 hours, and Brett had taken quite a lot of photographs of the empty buildings in their varying states of decay. We even managed to sneak into a couple of them. It wasn't the most exhilarating way to spend an evening, and, in fact, had left us both feeling particularly gloomy. We were taking a smoke break outside of an old metal shop, talking about how grim this place was, when Brett suggests, almost too casually, that we explore the Barrens. I told him that this was a stupid idea. He just edged me on with a, "Oh, come the hell on, dude, where's your adventurous spirit?" I asked him if he got any discerning vibes from the place at all, and told him that we should just go for a space cruise if he's feeling adventurous or whatever. Keep in mind, neither of us knew about the dogs at this point. Frankly, I'm not even all that sure that many people here do. We've simply been told to never go into the Barrens. End of story. Brett wouldn't be swayed, however. He insisted the only reason we'd been told to stay away was because it had been a popular party spot for high schoolers in past days, and the parents in town were simply doing their part to curb underage drinking. Eventually, I relented, realizing that now it was no longer about the thrill of exploring an off-limits area so much as it was a contest of wills, and Brett had no intention of losing to me. Reluctantly, I followed him into the woods, and after a rather dull 20-minute hike, I could see the Barrens through the trees and foliage. I surveyed the area a bit. Nothing to write home about, really. Dry, brown grass stretching towards the horizon, a couple of small hills, a single tree that looked legitimately fossilized. Everything looked inexplicably dead, especially in contrast to the teeming woodland which separates it from the rest of the industrial park. Hell, even the industrial park seemed like it had more life than this place. You'd be inclined to think that this place was in a perpetual drought. What was striking, however, was that the sky seemed to take on a sickly yellow color as soon as we exited the woods, whereas prior to that, it had been that hazy shade of blue that you normally see on a humid summer evening. We paused for another smoke break. I was honestly ready to head back as soon as we were finished. As I've said, this place was rather unremarkable to behold, but at the same time, I was gradually becoming aware of an intensely claustrophobic sensation creeping through my nerves. Even in this open space, something was off. We weren't supposed to be here. Brett felt differently, and once he had stamped out his cigarette, he proceeded to wander further into the Barrens. I stopped just short of begging him not to, but he was unfazed. He simply asked me if anything out here looked like it could possibly hurt us, and told me to look around. Everything is dead. I told him that I wasn't really okay with this, but he just continued on. We meandered about for a while, maybe a half hour, and everything looked more or less the same, no matter where we went. Dead grass, dead shrubs, dead sky. Every second that passed, I wish that Brett would have had his fill and we could go back to being bored rather than paranoid. Brett naturally said that it was just a weed cookie I'd eaten. and that I was overreacting. Though he added that he thought it was funny that the sky turned yellow like it did as soon as we crossed the woods. I told him, yeah, it's hilarious, probably a sign that we should get the hell out of here. He looked at me and said, "You're a real wet blanket sometimes, you know," and he trailed off. He'd stopped. His gaze was now trained on the ground at his feet. I really didn't want to look, but nevertheless, I nervously glanced down to see what had transfixed him so. To my horror, I recognized the partial remains of a human rib cage, nestled in the dry grass right at Brett's feet. It looked like a child's. There was a significant chunk missing from the left side. The bones appeared to have been broken off with force, as if something had bitten right through them. I stifled a scream. What could have possibly done this? I quickly turned away from the grisly display in the grass, not wanting to believe it was real. I was finished. I firmly told Brett that we needed to leave, and he didn't respond. "Brett, did you not hear me?" I tried to maintain a veneer of composure. "It's time to freaking leave." Brett still kept silent. His eyes were locked in a 100-yard stare. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't long before I realized why. There had to have been hundreds upon hundreds of bones littering the ground before us, some animal, some human. Panic washed over me in great violent waves. I felt nauseated and I couldn't breathe. I wanted to get as far away from this place as possible, but my feet seemed rooted in place. I felt as if my entire body was going to dissolve into a quivering soup. And then something else caught my attention, as my eyes darted frantically back and forth across the barrens. About 200 yards away, I could make out 6 vaguely animal-looking shapes. From that distance, I wasn't able to discern a whole lot of detail, and I thought at first they may have just been bushes or perhaps small trees. We both lingered there, staring dumbly ahead. "Yeah, I think I'm ready to go now," Brett murmured, starting to back away slowly. The shapes in the distance were moving. Yes, they were definitely moving, and they were coming towards us. "Yeah, let's get out of here," I snapped to attention. Wherever these things were, they were now 150 yards away and closing in on us, fast. Brett and I turned on our heels and sprinted towards the woods. I could hear their footsteps behind us. Great, rapid strides. They were gaining ground, and they were barking ferociously. But something wasn't quite right about how they barked. It almost seemed like someone had played a recording of a mob of rabid dogs through a bullhorn and cranked it up to full volume. Real distorted-like. Everything was a blur after that. The combination of adrenaline and THC was coursing ferociously in my veins. My legs seethed in agony, but I didn't care. All I knew is I needed to get the hell away. I don't know how we managed to outrun those things. Luck, maybe. The next thing I remember is Brett and I just reaching the edge of the woods, and whatever had given chase to us coming to a quick and complete halt. We were maybe 10 to 15 feet past the trees before we realized our pursuers had let up. As we hesitantly paused to catch our breath, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted a good look at what we had just run from. I turned and inched closer to the tree line, trying to keep myself somewhat concealed among the brush and vegetation. As I said, there were 6 of them, these dogs. They looked like Dobermans that had been given the George Romero treatment. Their gray flesh was stretched taut over their bones, and not one of them had any fur or hair to speak of. A couple even had whole patches of skin missing, as if ripped clean off. All had thick threads of saliva dangling from their bared fangs, and they stood between 6 and 8 feet tall. The most striking thing about them, though, was the eyes. Each menacing orb appeared to burn with white-hot spectral fire, a crucible of animosity, and all 11 of those eyes, yep, one of them was definitely missing an eye, were fixed squarely on me and Brett. I whispered, "They've stopped." Brett was gasping for air and said, "All the better. Let's just go, man." Obviously, we made it back to the industrial park, sufficiently traumatized and more eager to call it a night. Brett dropped me off at home, and we parted without saying a word to one another. And what could we say, really, after an experience like that? I was telling another one of my friends named Dustin about the encounter a few weeks later, and he gave me a rather perplexed look before saying, "Wait, so did you not know about the dogs?" I responded with, Clearly I didn't, otherwise I don't think I'd have gone messing around there. He just sighed and said, Jesus, I thought everyone knew about the dogs. He shook his head and continued, Yeah, I mean, it sucks that this is how you had to find out about them. Didn't your parents ever tell you not to go duck around in the barrens? I responded, Yeah, I always just figured it was just a myth, though. He let out a small laugh and said, Come on, man, I know you're not that stupid. The stories in this ducking town are never, ever substantiated. I get it that you're 19 and ballsy, but for real, there's some seriously dangerous shit that goes on here. If people tell you not to go poking around somewhere, then you don't go poking around there. I sighed and just said, Yeah. I hate being lectured, but I definitely deserved it. I haven't returned to the Barrens since that day, or even the industrial park. Still too shaken up, I guess, even after all these years. It's quite difficult to convey through mere words the primal terror I felt as Brett and I were being chased by these things. So I apologize if this one is somehow anticlimactic or boring. As for their backstory, I have no idea. Like I said before, not everyone knows about the dogs, and those who do are just as ignorant of what exactly they are or where they came from. Dustin insists that there's some category of demon and, for whatever reason, have found themselves trapped on our plane of existence. I'm not really a religious person, but demon is legitimately the only word that does them justice. Whatever they are, I'm just glad they didn't follow us past the trees. That's all I have for now. Side note, I've been hearing a lot more of that weird ice cream truck lately, but I still haven't seen it. It's kind of tricky to track down something that sounds like it's coming from up to 5 different directions. I'll be sure to keep you guys posted, though. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the stories. If you did, giving the video a like will really help out. If you know of any stories, or are an author of any stories that you would like to hear me narrate, be sure to let me know in the comments. Or you can tweet at me on Twitter at 2spooky4u5. Thanks for listening.